The third attempt at Fantastic Four in 20 years is coming next week, and I don't think it's going to be good. I know, hot take. There are a lot of reasons given online, and I'm sure you've probably heard most of them. One really interesting one is there's a credible rumor that they had to reshoot the ending because the original was that in order to defeat Galactus and save the Earth, the Four do something that ends up destroying the entire universe and launching them into the MCU's universe, meaning they defeat the villain by failing so spectacularly that they're worse than Thanos in terms of loss of life. You can see why that wasn't well received, and it's shocking that it made it through writing, pre-production, filming, and post-production before anyone pointed out that that's a pretty terrible ending. But I have a suspicion about another reason that I think it's going to be bad. I think that they're going to screw up the characters a lot. I know that doesn't sound like a unique take. There's been a lot of cultural war commentary to that effect, but I mean it slightly differently. You see, Marvel has a problem with new characters, a big problem. In fact, that wasn't always the case. When the MCU first started, way back with Iron Man, Marvel was in a kind of a weird position. They were fairly confident that they had a roster of superheroes who would make really good movies. But in all their pitches, no studios really believed them. So finally, in frustration, they decided to make their own movies, but they were in kind of a jam. You see, other studios had the film rights to their most popular heroes like Spider-Man and X-Men, so they would have to make movies using their more obscure heroes. They went with Iron Man, knowing that a lot of people were familiar with Iron Man as a concept, but they didn't really know Tony Stark. So they smartly put a lot of effort into introducing the world to Tony Stark. They decided to follow that up with the Incredible Hulk. And they could have gone into it with the mindset of people are familiar with the Hulk. We don't really have to introduce him. But they were blessed by a technicality. You see, the movie Hulk had come out a few years earlier, and it was uniquely bad. So they needed to wash their hands of that one and show audience what was different about theirs, which meant reintroducing the character to people. Honestly, people are sleeping on The Incredible Hulk. It's a really good movie. Thor, no one knew who comic book Thor was. So they needed to give him a character introduction. Captain America, everyone knows about Captain America, but they knew they had to introduce the world to Steve Rogers. After that came the Avengers, and they were all pulled together, and we all knew them. Soon after, we got Doctor Strange, Ant-Man, and the Guardians of the Galaxy, but something weird happened in Civil War that led to a bit of a problem, I think. Black Panther and Spider-Man were introduced in that movie. This doesn't seem too different at first. Black Widow, Hawkeye, Falcon, Bucky, Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, and War Machine were all introduced in movies that weren't theirs. But for Black Panther and Spider-Man, it was different because these were characters that were introduced and scheduled to lead their own movies soon after. It was the first time that Marvel had introduced future leads in a different movie, making their movie kind of a spin-off. Now, for comics, this was nothing new. A lot of characters were introduced in other characters' comics where they gained some popularity, and then they got their own comics later. But this approach was kind of new for the MCU, and it gave them the ability to make their first movie differently. They could skip the introduction and get right to the action. For Spider-Man, it worked because Spider-Man is crazy popular, and there had been 2 other film versions of him in less than 20 years. We know his world and setup. All that had to be done for him was to introduce the world to Tom Holland's take on the character, and frankly, I think Civil War nailed that. It also worked for Black Panther because a good portion of the story centered around Black Panther, so we spent time getting to know him as a person. Unfortunately, I think this went to Marvel's head a little bit. Marvel has not had an origin movie since Doctor Strange, a movie that introduces us to a new character and where that character is the lead. Now, you may want to argue, and I won't fault you for it, that Captain Marvel or the Eternals were origin stories. But they weren't. Origin stories kind of focus on a character gaining their powers and learning to use them responsibly. Captain America and the Eternals already had their powers, and I'd argue we're not really introduced to their characters, partially because some of them don't really have one. And as a result of this approach, they keep kind of botching characters. They feel like they introduced them inside of another movie when they actually kind of didn't, and then they don't take the time to let the audience get to know them in their own spin-off, which is a problem. That being said, Fantastic Four is the first time Marvel has had new characters in their own movie since the Eternals, which was 4 or 5 years ago. So what you say, they'll still be able to do it, but I don't think they will. I think that Marvel is going to be under the impression that everyone knows the Fantastic Four. There's no need to really introduce them to the world. We can start the story late and no one will mind. Why rehash common knowledge? After all, this is the first family of superheroes. The problem is that people know about the Fantastic Four. They know they exist, and they know about Mr. Fantastic, the Invisible Woman, the Human Torch, and the Thing, and what their powers are. But I bet the average man on the street doesn't know much more than that. It's like everyone knows who George Washington was, but how many have actually read a biography of the man? I don't think people know the Fantastic Four as well as they, and potentially Marvel, think that they do. I doubt how they got their powers is common knowledge, especially since there were 2 recently made movies and they had different origin stories. I doubt most know that Susan and Reed are married. I doubt most know that Johnny and Susan are siblings, especially when the last movie decided to make them different races. I doubt most know that Ben and Reed were high school buddies. I wonder how many know what their real names are. Now, all of that stuff is pretty easy to establish quickly, but when people don't know even that much, and I will admit that this is all speculation, they don't really know anything about the characters and who they are as people. And I'd be willing to bet that Marvel is going to neglect really introducing the world to these characters and allowing us to develop an emotional attachment to them. As a result, no one will care, and the movie will flop. But that's just a hypothesis. A film hypothesis. We'll see if I'm right soon enough, and you'll see me next time if you subscribe. Bye.